بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to everyone, and peace be upon you. And we would like to thank you all for returning back to Thoughts of the World, or Ifkar al Alam. And so this is the first video, if you will, as a follow-up to the introduction. And what we wanted to do in this channel, as we mentioned, was to discuss things related to the African American experience specifically, and to America in general, and offer some, I guess, Islamic uh, solutions uh, to the issues that we're going to talk about. And so, the first topic that we wanted to talk about in this video was, I guess, the African American. Okay. And the African American, when we talk about that, it has a lot of different definitions depending on who you talk to, right? And so uh, a person may feel that an African American, uh, their definition may be very different than the definition that you have. And so I wanted to offer a definition as to what I think an African American is, and then take it from there. Because once we have a level set as to what that definition is, then we can begin to talk about it, and talk about the experiences, and talk about the issues that we have in the African American community, and what we can do to possibly fix those issues, or offer solutions for those particular issues. And so, to level set, when we're talking about the African American, what exactly that means. And so we know that some people may prefer, a Black American, or not using that term at all. But for specific reasons, I'd like to use the term African American. I'd like to explain what it is that I mean by that. Okay, because it's important to understand who we are, or what we are, when we're trying to talk about a community. And so that's very important. And also why it is that we think the way that we think, and what are the roots of our culture, what are the flaws that we have in our culture, understanding these things. And so this is important in order to finding terminology, or excuse me, treatment for the ill effects, or the evil effects that we have within our community. And so the term African American, is I will refer to, are the people living in the United States of mainly or significant African ancestry. So the actual amount of their African ancestry can vary, sometimes as low as, say, 20%, or between 10 and 20%, because oftentimes phenotype a person who is probably under 10%, oftentimes, or even closer to 20%, may not necessarily present as an a person of African descent. And so, just depending on that person and how they grew up, and the cultural aspects that they've taken on, it can depend. And so from the other extreme, for up to 100% African DNA, if you will, or ancestry. Okay, and so the identity that we're talking about has been formed by factors within the culture within the United States that segregated people of African origins to live within their own community. And so the fact that they were forced, or that we were forced to live within our community, we were able to define what it is to be a part of our community, and different aspects or cultural aspects within our community as well. And as a result, the African American community found a unique culture that was influenced not only by the dominant European American culture around it, but by African, but significant Western African influences. And so when we look at the African American culture, we see that it has European aspects of influence, European American aspects of influence, and so, but then it also has African rooted or Western African rooted influences. And it's important to understand that the African American identity didn't choose to isolate itself and develop a separate identity from the rest of the mainstream America. This wasn't the choice per se of the African American people, but this was enforced or was legislated. This identity was legislated upon the people, and so and they were required by law initially to live by themselves or to live in separate communities, separate from the majority European American uh, culture. And so as a result, it developed differences, okay, in the way that they speak, and of course in the way that they identify themselves and so forth and so on, and their mechanisms that they chose to adapt in order to survive. And so these were all things that led to the development of the African American community. And so this wasn't their choice, and it was forced upon the African American people to create this identity, if you will, because oftentimes now, especially, you hear people that aren't aware of this will ask questions like, why is it that African Americans have such a different culture or different things, or they choose to do things differently than, say, mainstream culture? Like, why do they have their own colleges and universities? And why do they have, uh, different uh, social organizations, and why do they go to different places of worship than the majority European culture or European American culture? And again, it's important to understand that the reason why those separate uh, African American organizations were formed was because it was illegal at one point for them to join the dominant European group, and so that they had to form their own institutions in order to survive within the American culture, and so those institutions have continued to exist. And at no point has there ever been, or is there, a restriction for non-African American people to join these institutions. These are just institutions that were created in order that the African American people could survive. And so, like for example, HBCU, historical Black colleges and universities, um, these were established so that African Americans can have these college professionals in their communities to continue to advance their communities, but they've never been exclusively for African Americans. And so there are whites that have always attended these institutions, and in some cases, there are some HBCUs that are predominantly white now. And so they've never been, since their inception, they've never been exclusively for African American people. And so the same thing with Black fraternities and sororities, and of course, places of worship and so forth. And so as a result of these separations, the communities developed differently or different and than the dominant group. And so the African American culture developed differently than the dominant European American group. And so um, that's kind of in a nutshell as to, what we're talking about when we talk about some of the introductory information as to, what African American is. And so where did the African aspect come in? And so our official entrance into the U.S. Started in 1619. Now I say official because there are some theories that will argue that, that the African people have visited the Americas quite some time ago, and that some have made an argument that the original people of the Americas were Africans. I don't believe this. I believe that the Native Americans, the so-called Native American people, are the original people who inhabited the Americas. They've been here at least since the Ice Age, and there's much evidence for that. And I think that if there were Africans that were arrived in the Americas before the 16 or before the 17th century, I think that they were very few, and I think that but clearly they were not here before the so-called Native Americans were here. And so, but for the sake of our discussion here, I think that the 1619 was the official arrival of what has been coined as the 20 Africans that landed in the English colonies of Virginia. And so, interesting about that is that the word is that they came as indentured servants. And so, and I think this is a ridiculous assumption that they came as indentured servants, because if they were Africans, then obviously when they were their encounters with the Europeans, that they didn't speak European languages, and they couldn't read any contracts, and they couldn't make real decisions to decide that, well, hey, I'd like to come and visit or work in the United or in America at that time, in the British colonies in Virginia, and I'd like to have a contract to say that I'll work for a specific amount of time. And so obviously these individuals were kidnapped from the western coast of Africa, and they were taken to Virginia. And so, and then the Europeans at that time, the European settlers, may have thought in their mind, well, these people are indentured servants, and so, and they'll only work for a certain amount of time. But that doesn't negate the fact that they were kidnapped and they were taken to the Americas, and they were forced to work. And so whether or not they worked for the rest of their lives, or they worked for a certain period of time, and were emancipated after a certain amount of time, this was totally up to the decision of the Europeans that were surrounded them at that time, that dominated them at that time. And so some of them may have been freed, and some of them, or eventually were freed, and some of them may have worked for their rest of their lives. But without question, they were not. I'm sure they didn't understand this concept of indentured servitude, and that there was a level of slavery or involuntary forced labor that was inflicted upon these individuals. And so I think that idea of indentured servitude was just an attempt to uh, whitewash history, if you will, and kind of make it not seem as cruel as it actually was. And so these individuals came from the west coast of Africa, and from various locations that we'll talk about in this video. And so another thing to consider about this when it comes to the African American identity is that one must look at the origins of the African origins of the so-called African American people, and where do they actually come from. And so this is a subject of much debate and much question as to exactly which part or which ethnic groups or tribes that the African American people came from. Because when they were taken from or they were kidnapped from the western coast of Africa, they came from many different groups. And so then, of course, there was probably, in most cases, very little attention given to, or these people didn't have opportunities to give much information to their children, if any information at all, as to what their origins were. And so, and so, because of the nature of slavery and so forth, and so and there wasn't any attempt to, for example, to keep certain ethnic groups together, because this wasn't important for the Europeans at that time. It was important to get this free labor, and to to make sure that they had this free chattel slavery labor in place, so that they could get the work done that they wanted done. And so very little attempt was given to make sure that different ethnic groups stayed together. And of course, we know that most of these ethnic groups were not even able to pass on their languages, that their original languages. They were forced to learn the European languages that of the people that they were eventually enslaved for. And so then over time their children would have been taken away from them in some cases, or what have you, so they would never have an opportunity to preserve these languages incomplete and whole. And so, but we do know some of the ethnic groups that were affected from this transatlantic slave trade that took place that brought the Africans to the Americas. Now, again, we're talking about specifically the people that arrived within the United States, or what would become the United States, because the stories of the Africans that arrived in the Caribbean or in South America and other parts of the world, or the Arab slave trade and so forth, those don't specifically involve the experience of the African American people who have developed a culture within the United States. And so, but one of the tribes was the Mbundu people, and they're from Angola, and they were amongst the most enslaved Africans, according to some sources, and with most being transported to Brazil. And we know that, for example, Brazil had the highest number of enslaved Africans that arrived on their shores. And so most of the people who were descendants, or most of the enslaved that were traveled across the transatlantic slave trade, most of them ended up in Brazil. And so, so another tribe was the Yoruba tribe. And we know that the Yoruba tribe, excuse me, the ethnic group exists in southwest and north central Nigeria. It's a very large tribe, a very huge tribe, very significant tribe even to the day. And so the Yorubas were culturally forced in southern Nigeria. They were a dominant culture in southern Nigeria, and they were heavily engaged in palm oil trade during the transatlantic slave trade. And so there are African Americans that could have ancestry from these two ethnic groups. Also, the Igbo people, which is another significant tribe that lives in Nigeria, and they are in southeastern Nigeria, and they're a very large tribe, and quite a few people of this origin were taken to the Americas during the transatlantic slave trade. Interesting enough is that many African Americans, if not most, have significant Nigerian ancestry, and so this Nigerian ancestry could be a result of the Yoruba people or the Igbo people. So just depending on if they do a DNA test and they are able to distinguish that, and so that they're able to see that they do have a significant amount of Nigerian ancestry. For myself, I've done a DNA test and I have about roughly 30% Nigerian DNA, and I think the bulk of that, if I'm, I think is Yoruba descent. And so, and then also another tribe that we know about from the transatlantic slave trade that was affected by that is the Mende people, and they are a collective of many different ethnic groups that speak Mende-related languages, and they are a West African tribe, and you might find them in Mali or current-day Sierra Leone and other places. And the Mende, a very big group or sub-ethnic group within the Mende speaking languages, is the Mandinka nation, which is a dominant group in in Mali. And so they are quite significant in that Mansa Musa, the legendary rich person who existed during the Timbuktu dynasty, or who was a Mansa or a king, a sultan of that particular empire. He was a Mandinka. And so, but many African Americans are also descendants of the Mandingo people. And so, and they've had a significant history inside of Africa, as have the other tribes that have been mentioned, in Western Africa, as have the other tribes that have been mentioned, and also the Bakongo people, and they are found in the Republic of Congo. So those are a Bantu language speaking people. And so, and similar to the Mandinka people in Western Africa, they created one of the most prominent empires in their region of Central Africa in the Congo Empire. And so, and then also another group was the Fon people. The Fon are the largest ethnic group in Benin. and so which is Benin, we know is shares a border with Nigeria, and they're found, and of course, in southern Nigeria. And so they were a significant uh, uh, tribe or ethnic group that was kidnapped and brought to the Americas during the transatlantic slave trade. Another one is the Fulani people, and the Fulani people are a very, very large tribe. And so many, again, many African American people may have some Fulani ancestry. And the Fulani people originate in West Africa, but they are nomadic herding people, and they go as far west as the Senegambia region, all the way into within Africa. They go to the Sudan, but they're also people of Fulani descent in Saudi Arabia, and so they are very prolific when it comes to traveling, and they are basically stretched across the Sahel region and even as far south into you know uh, the bush regions, if you will, or the um, tropical regions within Africa as well. And so then also the Wolof people, which are primarily located in uh, Senegal. And so they, as are all these tribes that have significant history and prolific history in Africa. And so, and those are, another tribe that was represented in the transatlantic slave trade. And then the Abron people in Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, and Burkina Faso. This is another tribe that was affected by this transatlantic slave trade. And the last one I'll mention is the Chamba. And they were a tribe that was in this region. And they have a very interesting history in that they had uh, they had some issues with the Fulani people in Africa, and so but they were captured, during this slave trade, and they were brought to the Americas. Not necessarily a part of this discussion per se, but one thing that is important to understand when talking about the transatlantic slave trade. Okay, many will argue, or there's recent arguments about the fact that, well, the the heart of the blame that goes towards this kidnapping and so forth goes towards the African kingdoms, and they are responsible for, or they are mainly responsible, this argument goes, for what has happened to the African American or the African people in the transatlantic slave trade. And again, not necessarily a discussion for this particular video, but it's important to understand that Africa was completely colonized and dominated by the Europeans at the time. The British, the French, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Belgians, the Germans to a small degree, and the Dutch, and the French. I don't know if I mentioned them or not, but they were all basically took part and carved up Africa into different sections and colonized it and took the resources, the human resources, as well as the natural resources of the country, of those different regions. And so the African people at that time had no choice but to provide slaves or this human labor or for the Europeans at their demand. And so, and then we know that slavery has existed since the beginning of time, all over the world. We don't question that. But the African concept of slavery was very different than the Western European concept of slavery, in that the Africans didn't have this concept that a person would be a perpetual slave for their entire life, the way that the Europeans enslaved the African people. And so this was something that was not a part of their culture. That when they did enslave individuals they captured during war or from other tribes and so forth and so on, that eventually that person would become a part of the tribe. So they would be absorbed into the tribe. They would do some work. They would be enslaved for some time, and then they would eventually become a part of the tribe. And so it wasn't that Africans all saw themselves as the same people. So very similar to Europeans, the Africans saw themselves as different ethnic groups, different tribes, that spoke different languages, had different religions, different customs, and so they were very different. And so they didn't see the same way that the Europeans may have saw. The Germans would have no problem fighting with the French because they saw them as very different people. Now, from a physical standpoint, there are French people that may look very German, and some German people that may look very French, what have you. And probably years ago, um, because of European slavery, what have you, that they may have been or did some sort of indentured servitude. They may have been, their ancestors may have been indentured servants of those other countries and what have you. And so, but they were eventually absorbed into the mainstream tribes, or excuse me, the mainstream culture. And so that was a very similar situation in Africa as well. And so, but this concept of uh, perpetual chattel slavery that existed as a result of the transatlantic slave trade, this was something that did not exist in Africa, and it was very unique to them. So, long story short, this concept that these kingdoms were responsible for the slavery, and that's where the ultimate blame falls. This is very untrue, and this is just trying to deflect the blame that the Europeans and Western Europeans actually had for the transatlantic slave trade. And so, and this was sponsored, this is government sponsored by the governments of the countries that were the Western European countries that were mentioned, and they are the ones who are ultimately responsible for that. And then, of course, for the conditions that existed within the United States, the British were initially responsible for that until the Americans got their independence. But then after the independence, the American government was the one who was responsible for the treatment of those said African American people. And so history is what it is, and that is the fact. So as to what happened. And so, in all of those conditions are what led to the creation of the African American identity and to what it is that makes up an African American. And so when we talk about this particular definition of the African American people, we're talking about the people of African descent that have whose ancestors originated from this transatlantic slave trade. There are some African people, people of African descent that are Americans that live in the United States that have arrived from immigration, not from slavery, within the last 100 years or so. And so these people are technically considered African American, but they are not from the original groups of African American that we're talking about, who are descendants of the transatlantic slave trade. And so, although the second group or newer immigrants may have similarity culturally to the African American people, the original African American people, if you will, they are different, and they oftentimes have more cultural similarity to the country that they most recently originated from. Whereas the African American people, the original ones that I spoke of, would have some general West African cultural similarities with people in West Africa. The newer African American people who were not descendants of slaves would have an identity where they identify more specifically with the tribes that they come from. They know their tribal history, and they know the specific tribes. They may be more homogenous in the sense that they are not a mixture of many different tribes and without significant European ancestry, the way that the African Americans, the original African Americans, would have. And it's important to understand as well that the reason why these African American, the original African American people, have this European ancestry is oftentimes, especially if it was before if their ancestry, European ancestry comes into play before the 1960s, then it was against the law for African people and Europeans to get married or have children and so forth in the United States. And so what the conditions that led to these African people having European ancestry was from rape. And so which means that in many cases the slave masters or white men who were European men who were involved in dealing with Africans enslaved or kidnapped Africans, they would rape the women and they would get pregnant and have children. And of course, those children, unfortunately, were still enslaved for the rest of their lives. But their descendants would mix with other, African slaves or African Americans, if you will. And as a result, you have most African Americans. I think the percentage is around is it 30%, I believe, Western European ancestry. And that is due to this legacy of rape that resulted from these conditions. And so the slaves didn't have any choice. These women had no choice but to sleep with these European men whenever they felt like these European enslavers felt like doing so. So that is the reason for this lack of homogeneity amongst the African American people, and also the fact that they had very little choice as to some of the women and men were putting in breeding farms and so forth, and they were forced to have children with men who they didn't know or women who they didn't know and so forth. And so that led to the lack, this amalgamation, if you will, of different uh, Western culture, Western ethnic groups being amalgamated along with the European ancestry, and in some cases, very small cases of Native American ancestry that was involved in that mixture as well, admixture as well. And so that is how the African American people were eventually established. And with that, another very important, crucial piece of understanding the African American experience is to look at the uh, lifestyle or the religions of the people, of those African people when they came to the Americas. And so before they came at that time in the 1600s and up until the uh, 1800s, if there was no, or definitely before the 1600s, there was no Christianity in Western Africa. There was basically just three different religions, if you will, that dominated that part of Africa. And the first was animism, and animism is the attributing souls to plants and inanimate objects, statues, and so forth, and natural phenomena. So to say that, for example, thunder is the result of such and such a god that did this, that, and the other, and the water, stormy waters, is a manifestation of a god doing this, that, and the other. And so, in the beliefs in supernatural and inanimate objects having souls and so forth, this is the belief in animism. So this was very popular belief system, common in Western Africa at the time, as well as ancestral worship, which is a belief that our ancestors, when they die, that they have a means of communicating with those that are still living and passing on wisdoms and things to the people who are living and so forth, and so that they have the power to do this. And so this was a very big part of Western Africa as well. And then also, lastly, was Islam. And so in Islam is a belief that there is no deity worthy of worship except for Allah, and that Muhammad, the son of Abdullah, who existed who lived over 1400 years ago in Arabia, was a prophet. And I think there's over 1.2, if I'm not mistaken, billion Muslims in the world today. And so this was the other prominent religion that existed in West Africa at that time. And so, and there was no Christianity at the time, and so which was later introduced to Africa, or to West Africa, after the colonization by the Europeans and eventually sending over missionaries and colonizing and westernizing the Africans and subjugating them and so forth, and as well as the African American people. And so, in the African American people, when they came to the Americas, some of them tried to practice their traditional religions, be it one of the three, but in many cases, those practices were outlawed, and they were forced to take on Christianity. And there were some aspects of elements of animism, ancestral worship that continued on within, the African American people. And so, but for the most part, they were replaced with Western European Christian ideas. And then, as of late, within the 19th century, Islam was reintroduced to the African American people. And so, and then many African American people have come back to Islam, to their original beliefs that they had before they were brought to the Americas. And so, and that is my religion. And so, and this is, and I think that uh, that Islam, or the the reintroduction of Islam to the African American people, has made and will continue to make significant inroads into the people and changes to the African American culture that has been destroyed, and has, as a result of the transatlantic slave trade and the history involved in that, the brutality and so forth, and their existence within the Americas, within the United States, which has further led to the destruction of the people. And so, I think that Islam is something that has brought back, you know, solutions and alternatives to the lifestyle that the people have. So that is an introduction as to the African American people and who they are. And so, and thank you again for coming to um, Ifkar al-Alam, or Thoughts of the World. And we'll have follow-up videos explaining other aspects of the African American experience. Thank you.